The Battle of Marengo, the victory that secured the Consulate. By 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte had successfully executed the coup of 18 Brumaire, dissolving the corrupt Directory and establishing himself as the first consul of France, a position of immense and nearly absolute power. However, his authority was fragile, and his new regime, the Consulate, faced immediate existential threats, both political and military. The political legitimacy of his rule, which was born of a military coup, depended entirely on his ability to deliver what the Directory had failed to provide: peace and stability. But the war against the Second Coalition, particularly Austria, was going disastrously. French forces in Italy had been pushed back, losing nearly all the gains of the 1796 campaign, and the crucial strategic fortress of Genoa was under siege and nearing collapse. The political situation demanded that Napoleon act not merely as a statesman, but as a victorious general. A military defeat would instantly lead to the collapse of the Consulate, the return of royalist plotting, and his own political ruin. He needed a victory so profound, so stunning, that it would silence all domestic opposition and force Austria to the negotiating table. The strategic objective was clear: to strike a decisive blow against the main Austrian army operating in northern Italy, commanded by the elderly but highly competent General Michael von Melas. Napoleon devised a strategy that was breathtaking in its audacity and theatrical in its execution. Instead of reinforcing the Rhine front, where the main armies were traditionally positioned, he decided to strike directly at Melas's rear in Italy, a move designed to cut the Austrian commander off from his primary lines of communication and retreat. The key to this strategy was the unprecedented move of the Army of Reserve across the formidable Alps mountains, a feat of logistics and will designed to shatter the Austrian strategic calculus. The march across the Alps in May 1800 was a logistical and psychological masterpiece, carefully engineered for maximum propaganda effect. While Melas expected Napoleon to attack through the conventional passes, Napoleon chose the most difficult and least defended route, the Great St. Bernard Pass. This was an undertaking of immense difficulty, requiring thousands of men to drag heavy artillery pieces, supply wagons, and ammunition through treacherous snow and ice, often by hand, using specially constructed sleds and hollow logs.
The journey was an intentional echo of Hannibal's legendary crossing of the Alps, an act designed to link Napoleon's name directly with the great classical generals of antiquity, a key element of his self-created mythos. The entire arduous march was completed in just 5 days, successfully placing the French army onto the plains of Lombardy, directly in Melas's strategic rear. The initial strategic success of the Alpine crossing instantly presented General Melas, the Austrian commander, with a devastating predicament. He was deeply entrenched in the siege of Genoa, where the French forces under General Massena were holding out with desperate resilience. Melas found himself caught between two critical French forces: Massena's tenacious garrison tying down his rear, and Napoleon's main army suddenly materialized on his line of retreat toward Mantua and Austria. Melas had to abandon the siege of Genoa to face this new existential threat. Melas's primary objective was to concentrate his dispersed forces to break out eastward and secure the main Austrian supply route. He began moving his army toward the small town of Alessandria, near the river Bormida, where he intended to use the fortress as a rallying point. Napoleon, meanwhile, was operating with a critical lack of accurate intelligence. He severely underestimated the speed and sheer size of the Austrian concentration. He believed Melas would be forced to retreat further east, requiring Napoleon to intercept him along the routes leading to the Mincio River. This severe miscalculation led to Napoleon committing a fatal tactical error. Believing the main Austrian force was already fleeing, Napoleon began to disperse his own army to cover multiple potential escape routes. He sent General Louis Desaix, one of his most competent commanders, along with a strong corps of 5,000 men southward toward the town of Rivalta. This was a deliberate effort to block a supposed Austrian retreat route, but it dangerously weakened Napoleon's central force, just as the Austrians were about to launch their main attack. The stage was set for the Battle of Marengo, but the French were completely unprepared. The Austrian army, numbering around 31,000 men, was fully concentrated and ready to break out. Napoleon's remaining central force, scattered and believing they were merely pursuing a retreating enemy, amounted to only about 22,000 men.
The French were caught entirely off guard, illustrating the profound risk inherent in a strategy that prioritizes speed and assumption over solid reconnaissance. On the morning of June 14, 1800, the Battle of Marengo opened not with a strategic French thrust, but with a powerful and completely unexpected Austrian attack. General Melas, the Austrian commander, had decided to abandon the siege of Genoa and instead launched a full-scale breakout from Alessandria, aimed eastward across the Bormida River. Melas's objective was to smash through the disorganized French lines, secure the vital road to Piacenza, and retreat safely toward Mantua. The French forces scattered across the Marengo plain were stunned. They had expected to engage a retreating army, not an offensive army ready for a massive, coordinated assault. The animation should immediately highlight the Austrian numerical and organizational superiority at this initial stage. Melas commanded nearly 31,000 troops, including the fearsome heavy cavalry, while Napoleon had dispersed his forces, leaving only about 18,000 men under direct command on the main battlefield. The Austrian attack proceeded across the Bormida River, utilizing two main pontoon bridges under the cover of a dense morning fog. The initial clash was focused on the village of Marengo, where the French troops under General Victor fought tenaciously to slow the Austrian advance. The fighting was brutal and relentless. The French divisions were systematically overwhelmed by the coordinated Austrian infantry columns and the power of their artillery. The French line was stretched thin and began to buckle under the sustained pressure. Napoleon was miles away, still convinced that the main Austrian force was further east. His initial attempts to rally the troops were hampered by the speed of the Austrian advance and the severe tactical disadvantage of being caught out of position. By the early afternoon, the French position was critical. General Victor's entire corps had been shattered, pushed back, and decisively routed. The Austrian cavalry repeatedly charged the exposed French flanks, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing massive disorder. The French were in full retreat, their cohesion broken, and their defeat seemed absolute and irreversible. Napoleon himself, now arriving on the scene, saw his army disintegrating before his eyes, a stark visual confirmation of his own strategic error in dispersing his forces.
This moment represented the near-total collapse of the Consulate's military backing, and Napoleon's political life was hanging by a thread. The Austrian victory was virtually complete. By early afternoon, the situation for the French was desperate. The French lines had completely shattered under the sustained Austrian assault, and the retreat was turning into a rout. The Austrian commander, General Melas, a man in his 70s, was so confident in his crushing victory that, having sustained a slight injury, he retired from the field around 3 p.m., dispatching couriers to Vienna with the news that the battle is won. He delegated the mop-up operation to his chief of staff, General Zoch. This moment of Austrian overconfidence in command transfer proved to be the second critical factor in the battle's eventual outcome. Napoleon, who arrived on the battlefield around 11 a.m., immediately took personal control of the disintegrating army. Seeing the panic, he began to rally the retreating troops, performing a crucial act of damage control. He was calm and determined despite the obvious disaster. He personally led the remaining units into a new defensive position anchored around the village of San Giuliano. He utilized his disciplined consular guard, his personal elite reserve, to stiffen the collapsing center, slowing the Austrian pursuit and buying precious time. This defensive stand was critical. It prevented the rout from becoming a complete annihilation. The most important decision Napoleon made was the urgent summons for General Louis Dessau. Dessau, along with his 5,000-man corps, was still miles away on the presumed retreat route toward Rivalta based on Napoleon's earlier mistaken intelligence. Around 1 p.m., realizing his error, Napoleon dispatched multiple furious riders with the urgent direct order, Dessau, return immediately and fall upon the enemy flank. This summons was a massive gamble, relying entirely on Dessau's speed, efficiency, and proximity. Napoleon's strategy shifted from winning the battle to simply surviving long enough for Dessau to arrive. For the next 3 agonizing hours, the small, exhausted French force fought a desperate, bloody delaying action at San Giuliano. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but the knowledge that Napoleon himself was present, coupled with the arrival of the elite consular guard, instilled a desperate resilience.
They fought for time, measuring their survival in minutes, waiting for the sound of Desaix's approaching drums. The agonizing wait for General Louis Desaix defined the climax of the Battle of Marengo. Napoleon's remaining forces, anchored at San Giuliano, fought with desperate tenacity, but their ammunition was low, their ranks were decimated, and the continuous Austrian pressure under General Zoch was relentless. The French defeat remained a matter of minutes, not hours. Then, around 4 p.m., just as the last reserves were being committed and the Austrian victory seemed finalized, the sound of drums and rapid troop movements were heard from the south. General Desaix had received Napoleon's urgent summons and, relying on the efficiency that made him one of the army's best commanders, immediately turned his 5,000 men around from Rivalta and executed a punishing forced march back to the battlefield. The scene was one of immense relief for the French, but stark confusion for the Austrians, who believed the fighting was essentially over. Desaix's arrival was the true turning point, a dramatic reversal of fortune fueled by sheer luck, impeccable timing, and Napoleon's early strategic mistake. Desaix, meeting Napoleon, surveyed the wreckage of the field and famously offered his advice. The battle is completely lost, but there is time to win a new one. This concise assessment, combining realism with aggressive optimism, perfectly captured the moment. Napoleon instantly agreed. He ordered Desaix to deploy his fresh troops immediately into a new line of battle near San Giuliano. Crucially, Napoleon utilized the one asset he had conserved, the consular guard and the remaining artillery, to support Desaix's counterattack. The arrival of these fresh, disciplined troops, combined with the presence of Napoleon himself, completely revitalized the demoralized French remnants. The French forces, now concentrated and renewed, prepared for a massive counter-assault against the unsuspecting Austrian column. The Austrian commander, General Zoch, who had taken over after Melas retired, was leading a massive Austrian column of elite troops in pursuit of the French routed. He believed he was simply mopping up a beaten enemy and was totally unprepared for a renewed, aggressive offensive by a fresh corps. The moment was ripe for a decisive counterstroke. General Desac, having assessed the disastrous state of the French army, launched his counterattack with immediate ferocity, relying on the freshness and discipline of his troops. The unexpected offensive slammed directly into the exposed flank of the leading Austrian column under General Zach, who was advancing carelessly, assuming victory was already theirs. The impact of Desac's corps, combined with a sudden devastating artillery barrage, shattered the Austrian formation. The moment of total reversal, the point where the battle irrevocably swung, came through the aggressive genius of General François-Étienne de Kellermann. Kellermann, commanding a small but crucial brigade of heavy French cavalry, observed the momentary confusion and disorder in the Austrian ranks immediately following Desac's infantry attack. Recognizing the vulnerability of the massed Austrian column, Kellermann executed an impromptu, devastating charge. His small force sliced into the Austrian flank and rear with overwhelming force, catching the troops entirely off guard and turning the confusion into a headlong rout. General Zach, the overall Austrian field commander, was captured during this sudden, overwhelming melee. The success of Kellermann's cavalry charge was not a planned maneuver. It was a brilliant act of coup d'œil, intuitive battlefield judgment executed at the precise moment of maximum opportunity. It simultaneously captured the Austrian general, paralyzed the forward advance, and threw the entire Austrian command structure into chaos. However, this glorious moment of triumph was immediately shadowed by tragedy. General Louis Desac, the true savior of the battle, was struck by an Austrian musket ball as he led his troops forward, collapsing and dying almost instantly. His final words, widely reported though possibly embellished, reflected his awareness of the victory. "I have done enough for the Republic, and I die content." Desac's sacrifice lent a profound tragic heroism to the otherwise political victory. The Austrian pursuit was now completely reversed. The troops, demoralized by the capture of their commander and stunned by the aggressive French counterattack, turned tail and fled back across the Bormida River toward Alessandria. The day which had been lost before noon was won by sunset. The Battle of Marengo was not merely a military victory, it was a profound political lifeline for Napoleon Bonaparte and the entire Consulate. The moment General Malaz retired from the field, convinced of his victory, marked the nadir of Napoleon's career. The subsequent arrival of General Desac was the ultimate deus ex machina, a dramatic intervention fueled by impeccable timing, efficiency, and sheer chance. Desac's assessment, "The battle is completely lost, but there is time to win a new one," is arguably the most famous and decisive quote in Napoleonic history, perfectly capturing the urgency of the moment. The analysis here must stress the temporal advantage. Desac's fresh corps hit the Austrian column at the precise moment of their organizational complacency. The Austrians, believing they were in pursuit of a defeated enemy, had transitioned from a fighting formation to a marching formation, making them acutely vulnerable to the sudden, disciplined counterattack. The brilliant improvised charge of Kellermann's cavalry transformed the tactical surprise into a rout by capturing the Austrian command structure, General Zach. This instantaneous beheading of the command paralyzed the entire Austrian army. The victory, secured by the sacrifice of Desac, was instantly seized upon and shaped by Napoleon's genius for propaganda. The true narrative, that Napoleon had initially miscalculated, dispersed his forces, and been saved by a timely recall, was immediately suppressed. Instead, the official narrative broadcast to Paris and Europe was that the first consul, always in control, had deliberately lured the Austrians into a trap, utilizing Dessau's corps as a planned reserve for a decisive counterstroke. The entire day was reframed as a brilliant example of Napoleon's unfailing military foresight. The tragic death of General Dessau was incorporated into this propaganda masterpiece. Dessau was not just a savior, he was portrayed as a heroic martyr whose final act of loyalty was ensuring the Republic's safety. This narrative lent a profound, tragic heroism to the victory, diverting attention from the political fragility of the Consulate and the military blunders of the morning. Marengo became not a battle of luck, but a testament to Napoleon's destiny. The immediate political effect was absolute. The news of the crushing victory silenced all internal opposition in Paris. Royalist plots collapsed, and the public, desperate for order, cemented their faith in the first consul.
The victory at Marengo guaranteed the survival of the Consulate and paved the way for Napoleon to initiate his sweeping domestic reforms, including the Napoleonic Code. The Battle of Marengo immediately led to the decisive political outcome that Napoleon desperately needed. The day after the battle, the demoralized and politically isolated Austrian High Command, under the returned General Melas, sued for peace. The resulting armistice of Alessandria was devastating for Austrian power in Italy. The Austrians were forced to evacuate all of Piedmont and Lombardy west of the river Mincio, effectively surrendering all the territory they had fought so hard to regain during the Second Coalition. This single victory reversed an entire year of French setbacks and gave Napoleon total military leverage. The armistice was merely the prelude to the definitive peace. Though fighting continued in Germany, where General Moreau secured a major victory for the French at Hohenlinden later that year, Marengo guaranteed that Austria would be forced to sign a humiliating, separate peace treaty. The resulting Treaty of Lunéville in 1801 officially recognized the French Republic's control over northern Italy and the Rhine, solidifying French dominance on the continent. This outcome fulfilled Napoleon's promise to the nation and secured his regime. The political significance of Marengo cannot be overstated. By delivering a total military victory, Napoleon silenced the internal political opposition. The coup of 18 Brumaire was now retroactively legitimized by success. The political enemies who had questioned the legality of the consulate now had to concede the unparalleled stability and glory provided by the first consul. Marengo created a narrative of military infallibility that provided the necessary political foundation for Napoleon to initiate his most ambitious and far-reaching domestic reforms, including the reorganization of the state finances, the establishment of the Bank of France, and the intensive work on the civil code that would become the Code Napoleon. This battle transformed the first consul from a successful and ambitious general into the indispensable savior of France. It proved that Napoleon's command was essential for the nation's security and prosperity. The victory allowed him to concentrate the revolution's resources into his own hands, channeling its immense energy away from abstract political debate and toward personal power and the consolidation of the state. The Battle of Marengo ultimately secured the consulate and defined Napoleon's public image for the next 2 decades. The victory was a complete study in risk, error, and recovery. It exposed Napoleon's greatest weakness, his tendency to rely on assumptions and disperse his forces. But it also highlighted his greatest strengths, his unparalleled ability to recover from disaster, his psychological command over his troops, and his speed in bringing forces to bear at the decisive moment. The core of the victory lay in the simple but profound principle of temporal advantage and surprise. Dessau's arrival transformed a defeated, retreating army into a fresh, concentrated counter-attacking force that hit an unsuspecting, overconfident enemy.
It was a victory achieved not by superior numbers, but by the superior will and the decisive intervention of a fresh corps at the precise point of the enemy's maximum vulnerability. Napoleon, a master of media and image control, immediately took full ownership of the victory. The tragic death of Desai, the true tactical savior, was instantly woven into the tapestry of imperial propaganda. Desai became the perfect martyr, the heroic sacrifice whose death ensured the survival of the nation under its indispensable leader. Napoleon secured the battle, but he won the narrative. Marengo ensured that the French people would see their first consul not as a politician who seized power through a coup, but as the military genius whose destiny was to protect the Republic. The victory granted him the 3 years of peace necessary to consolidate his authority, leading directly to the lifetime consulship and ultimately the imperial crown. Marengo was the moment the consulate stopped being an experiment and became the permanent structure of France.